Black Mountain Institute. It's one of the best if you know you knows in Las Vegas. I've been a huge fan of their literary and cultural programming for almost 20 years, and I am so excited about their upcoming season. This fall, BMI is bringing incredible writers to Las Vegas, including novelist and photographer Teju Cole on November 19th. And hey, I'm even moderating an event on October 10th with big-time lawyer Stephen Bright. Plus, all events are free. So go visit blackmountaininstitute.org for more info.
A 2-year-long saga that started with the killing of Review Journal investigative reporter Jeff German and culminated in this week's trial of former county public administrator Robert Tellez for his murder is now coming to a close. Yesterday at noon, a jury declared Tellez guilty of first-degree murder. So today on CityCast Las Vegas, I'm here with our co-host David Figler, a longtime criminal defense attorney here in Las Vegas, and he's going to help us break this trial down. It's Thursday, August 29th. I'm Sonia Cho Swanson, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. Okay, David. Robert Tellez was found guilty of the murder of Jeff German yesterday. How surprised were you by this verdict?
I have to say, not terribly surprised by the verdict. A lot of the evidence had been telegraphed beforehand, as was the defense, because of so much litigation that preceded the actual trial itself. I think the surprising thing for everybody, because of the abundance of both direct and circumstantial evidence in this case, and in Nevada, a jury is allowed to consider both basically equally. I mean, the only thing that wasn't presented in this case essentially was a confession.
And the murder weapon.
Well, the murder weapon itself was not retrieved. There was no confession, and there was no eyewitness who picked Robert Tellez out of like a lineup or something. But short of that, there were all the other things that you usually see when you see a murder conviction. But something during that trial kept the jury deliberating over the course of 3 days, a total of about 11 hours or more.
Okay, so we heard from the prosecution first. What do you think were the strongest points the prosecution made?
Well, clearly the strongest evidence had to be that Rob Tellez's DNA was presented as being underneath the fingernails of Jeff German after he was found dead. How DNA would show up underneath someone's fingernails, while the prosecution doesn't have to show how it got there, I think common sense takes over that there was some contact between the two, and probably in a not very friendly way to get someone's
scuffle.
DNA under the fingernails.
Right.
I mean, there was other evidence as well that the car that seemingly involved was a fairly distinctive vehicle that happened to also be owned by Rob Tellez's wife, that some of the clothing identified by the suspect by like neighborhood cameras and things of that nature also appeared to show up at Rob Tellez's house, though obviously they're not going to be able to do a one-for-one comparison, but you see the perpetrator wearing a straw hat, and then you see what appears to be a cut-up straw hat over at Rob Tellez's house, stuff like that.
Right.
And
the notorious white Nikes that were attempted to be cut apart found under Tellez's couch.
As well. Yes, those two. So a lot of that type of evidence, but maybe something which is kind of interesting in that while the prosecution doesn't have to produce a murder weapon, it's not required under law, the prosecution also doesn't have to produce a motive for the murder. But this was really pounded on by the DAs here, that there was ample motive. So much so that they created a timeline of when that motive went from just being sort of upset at Jeff German for writing articles that were unfavorable to Tellez and the public administrator's office under his watch.
Well, to recap that, basically Jeff German had been investigating a toxic workplace that Tellez purportedly headed, including an affair with a coworker.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And there was more stories coming. And what the prosecution did was they pinpointed when Tellez likely was made aware that there were more stories coming. And then all of a sudden, the presentation was that searches for Jeff German's address are showing up on Rob Tellez's computers, and pictures of his home and some manner of surveillance from a Popeyes nearby and routes and all that stuff. So there was a lot of what we call circumstantial evidence in this case, but it was very compelling circumstantial evidence. It wasn't sort of, I wouldn't categorize any of it or much of it as flimsy.
Yeah. And then to top it all off, Tellez actually lost his bid for re-election in the wake of some of Gehrman's articles.
Yeah, and prior to what the prosecution depicted as being that turning point when he decided he was going to punish Jeff Gehrman for essentially destroying his life, his career, and maybe even his marriage.
So Tellez took the stand this week against his lawyer's recommendations, and he spun some pretty wild tales of conspiracy theories. What was that all about?
Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise. Typically, when a witness takes a stand, even if it's the defendant in a case accused of the crime, that person would be subject to questions from their own lawyer and then cross-examination from the prosecution and then more or less a rehabilitation line of questioning from their own lawyer. Here, Tellez just was able to go on for hours uninterrupted.
Wow.
He took an interesting approach. The beginning of it was basically communicating to the jury that he was a decent guy, that he had worked really hard in his job and he believed in his job, and that during the course of his job as the public administrator, which essentially oversees the estates of people who die without a will or without apparent heirs, that he uncovered a vast and large, I don't even want to call it a conspiracy, just a bunch of people acting in a way that he felt was contrary to the interest of the heirs of people who die. And he was going to expose this realty company specifically and their practices of going to court and, taking over the estates of dead people to the peril of the actual relatives and heirs of those people. And if people are really interested in this whole story, it's not a made-up story. There was some good reporting in the Review Journal earlier this year from Michael Davison and Eli Siegel talking about the practice that is strangely allowed under Nevada law for strangers to kind of come in and ask the court to take over estates. What was kind of unbelievable was what happened next in the testimony, which Tellez suggested was the motive for someone to frame him. That his internal investigation and what he categorized as essentially whistleblowing caused this realty company and others to conspire together to frame Rob Tellez for the murder of Jeff Gehrman, and that somehow they were able to make it look like Rob Tellez had done everything down to the very fine detail of somehow planting Rob Tellez's DNA underneath Jeff Gehrman's fingernails. Yeah. A real rough way to go. He didn't have specifics. He just said, look, these people really hated me. I was about to destroy their lives. And all of a sudden, I'm framed for murder and they're off the hook. You connect the dots, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, was kind of the pitch.
Gotcha. So he didn't actually present any evidence backing up these claims of a conspiracy theory. It was just him presenting a motive, also unsubstantiated. And in his retelling, he is both the victim and the hero of his version of the story.
Yeah. And I don't know how well that plays with the jury. However, he did also point out some strong inconsistencies, and this is what his defense attorneys did, about the investigation itself and some gaps.
So speaking of the defense attorneys, do you think Tellez's defense made any good points?
Absolutely. I mean, these are seasoned attorneys here. Robert Draskevich, especially, has been a prominent criminal defense lawyer for years. He has many great victories under his belt. Michael Horvath is a very, very smart young lawyer who worked the case with Mr. Draskevich. We're always dealt the hand of facts that we are given. We are always limited by the investigation that's done. Because remember, when a murder happens, they call the police to investigate, not defense attorneys. Defense attorneys usually, at best, would have one or two investigators available to go try to recreate stuff or find video or whatever after the fact, and it's really a daunting task. So you get what you get. That is where you start most of these cases. And what you do, because of those circumstances, is you go through with a fine-tooth comb all the evidence you been provided and you look for holes. I mean, that makes sense, right?
Yeah, well, given that like our criminal justice system is set up to be presumed innocent until proven otherwise, right?
Sure. That's a very aspirational sentence that, based on everything that I've said so far in this conversation and, maybe hundreds, if not thousands of conversations I've had with people over the last 33 years, that is really aspirational.
Okay, all right.
Because
the reality
again,
of the trenches.
You don't have to prove that you didn't do it. But like we saw in this case, a little proof would have gone a long way, probably.
Let's get into the specifics of this case. What were some of the best points that Tellus's defense made?
Well, Tellus's defense did a great job of focusing on what the police didn't do, how they didn't run down all the leads, and how they had come to rob Tellus pretty early in the investigation to the exclusion of any other possibilities. They also talked about some evidence that might have been exonerating for Rob Tellus, either not being gathered or being dismissed out of hand early on. Stuff like video in his neighborhood, which would have shown the cars coming and going in a way consistent with the way that the police laid it out and the district attorney laid it out. They also did a really good job of trying to enhance some of the video that was introduced by the police to make it look like, had the police done a better job, it might have shown that it wasn't Rob Tellus who was involved. And specifically, there were some screenshots from a video of a vehicle that was presented by the district attorney as being proof of Rob Tellus driving in his wife's car through his neighborhood. And when you did a zoom in, the defense attorneys suggested that it showed a person who had a full head of hair. And Rob Tellus is a very, very bald individual.
Yes.
And not only that, but they had a witness who interacted with the driver of that vehicle who had testified that there was nothing that stood out or unusual, such as like wearing an obvious wig or being nervous or anything like that. And so they really rode that fact quite heavily.
Okay. All right. Now I'm really curious. Were there any other twists, turns, or surprises in this trial?
Yeah, there really were. Given that we knew so much about this case ahead of time, this is the adversary system. The prosecution has to give all the evidence that they are aware of or in their possession to the defense. That is a hard and fast rule. But they don't have to tell them all their plots and plans on how to use that evidence. And so there was one big surprise that probably sealed the deal, even though there was substantial evidence anyway, from the prosecution side. And that was a photo of a message that Rob Tellus's wife had sent Rob Tellus during a relevant time frame connected to the murder that just basically said, "Where are you?" And that message does not show up on Rob Tellus's phone. So they were able to prove to a degree that a message was sent, and seemingly this one message was deleted or erased, perhaps. That was the insinuation from Rob Tellus's phone, because that would have not his wife not knowing where he was when he was allegedly at home, because he said he was either at home or at the gym or whatever it was when the murder occurred, all of a sudden now had this weird quirk to it. And I think when Rob Tellus testified, he wasn't aware that that was going to be sprung on him. And so that became sort of the surprise twist, is that they pull out the photo of the Apple Watch that showed the wife's message to him. The prosecutor pointed this out in the closing argument. Did you see Tellus's face when I showed him that picture? That was someone who had crafted a huge narrative that didn't know we were going to bring that up. So that was kind of the twist on their side. On the defense side, the video was pretty strong. The does he have hair or not was a pretty strong move because it was right there for the jury to look at. And the jury did, in fact, ask for some extra laptop or something, presumably to look at that evidence as well. Yeah,
because we were waiting
during their lengthy deliberations.
We were waiting for the verdict to come back, and then suddenly it's like, oh, is this something happening in the courtroom? But no, it's the jury asking a question, and they were asking for a laptop.
A laptop to be able to view that particular evidence. Look, there was a lot of things that were leaving out here. The very peculiar little video that the prosecution had put together that wasn't evidence per se, but was part of argument, which was a side-by-side of Rob Tellis walking normally, because they had some footage of that, because he had done a video interview with Jeff Garman, of all people, and showed he had a significant gait in his walk, the way he walked.
Yeah.
And then they
I saw
showed
that video too.
the suspect with the straw hat and the
outside
the
of
vest
Garman's home.
seemingly having a similar walk. And that's something else that the jury seems through their questioning to have wanted to review anew.
So is that why the verdict took so freaking long to come back? I mean, the jury deliberated for over 11 hours, almost 12 hours, I think, right?
Yeah. Jury deliberations are secret. Typically, juries don't love lingering on what happened in the jury room because it can be pretty tense. My experience tells me that somebody either wanted to make sure, as a sign of respect to the attorneys, to go through every single shred of evidence that was there, good and bad, or somebody was actually convinced that there was still some reasonable doubt based on, the defense job, and was challenging how clear the evidence may have seemed to other jurors. And, we've heard stories in the past of jurors actually getting into, verbal, if not physical confrontations if it takes too long. Look, 11 hours does sound like a really long time when there seemed to be so much overwhelming evidence, but you just don't know what they focus on. There's no rules on how a jury is supposed to deliberate. They pick a four-person, and that four-person kind of says, okay, here's how we're going to go about it. And they do that. And sometimes that could take 11 hours, especially if one or more people are not firmly convinced that the prosecution has proved it beyond a reasonable doubt. That's probably what happened here, was that there were one or two holdouts who were like, look, this is a man's life at stake. I'm not going to rush to judgment. There was a lot of information that was thrown at us. These jury instructions are a little confusing. I want to make sure if we're going to do this, we do this right.
So the jury came back with a sentence fairly quickly. What do you make of the sentence?
Yeah, I mean, life with the possibility of parole. They were convinced that, maybe somewhere down the line, because maybe this was just an emotional decision that he made that he needs to pay for, that, in 20-some years, a parole board can look at him and see if it makes sense to release him back into society. They saw a little bit of humanity there. They showed a little bit of mercy. The fact that Tellis's family testified and didn't want to not have any chance, even decades from now, to be with him again, is compelling sometimes. It's basically comes down to mercy, especially since he's really never done anything like this before.
David, this has really got me thinking because, you've spent a significant part of your career as a criminal defense attorney. So I think you'll know where I'm coming from when I say that a guilty verdict, however warranted, it just doesn't feel like a joyous occasion. You know what I mean? Like, it just, I know that, like, the victim's family in this case are looking for some sense of closure or justice, whatever that means. But, I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is, what does it even mean for someone like Robert Tellis to face, quote unquote, justice? And, like, how are we supposed to feel at the end of a trial like this one, especially from your perspective?
Well, it gives us a result. And, we don't like unfinished stories. And we also like accountability. When you start talking about what is and isn't justice, I mean, we can talk for hours about that. It's philosophy,
a lifetime.
right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, you want someone to be held accountable, but how does that translate to a number of years? I mean, some people think that a person should get the death penalty. Some people think that they should get, die in prison. Some people feel like people can be redeemed or rehabilitated. From the family's perspective, they're hurt. They're hurting inside. And I think that, unfortunately, society or maybe even the prosecutors somehow suggest that by getting a guilty verdict and getting a maximum sentence, you'll feel better. You'll feel better about the loss of your loved one. Of course, it never brings them back, and it never creates a wholeness. It is born out of vengeance, and it's completely understandable that you would, in fact, loathe, hate, despise the person who took your loved one away, and you would want them to suffer. Is that justice or not? That is the question we could talk about for hours, or days, or weeks, or lifetimes.
Yeah. Well, how do you feel at the end of this trial then, David?
Well, I feel that the verdict does signify an accountability that,
Okay.
our process, for better or worse, it's all we have, that there needs to be a declaration that we are convinced that the person did it, and we are convinced that they were given every opportunity to advocate that a jury should not find that they were guilty of the offense, that the system is in place. And as far as it works, right? When we talk about these bigger ideas like justice, we tend to just focus on sort of the theatrics of a trial and the punishment and whether it's, from our perspective, severe or not severe enough. I think that's a process that we as humans are not particularly great at. It turns out not to be a science, but a feeling, and that's hard.
Yeah.
But,
maybe someday
it has to be done, Sonia. I mean,
Yeah,
you
it has to
can't
be done.
let people murder people
Yeah.
and just say, well, let's feel like we should have a healing moment here.
Yeah, or at least until our AI robot overlords overtake the justice system, David, and then it's completely emotionless, all facts.
Well,
right?
and then, the robots probe into our brains and reprogram us so that we never do that again.
See, perfect, fixing the system.
Oh, boy.
All right, well, thank you so much, David. This was such an enlightening conversation.
Anytime, Sonia.
And that's all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. If you enjoyed the show, please go tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter, Hey Las Vegas. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Take care. The one holdout can really hold up the process.
Or turn it all around.
Or that.
Go see the movie 12 Angry Men.